What happens when a forgotten letter in a billionaire's briefcase exposes a crime that destroyed an entire family 40 years ago? When a young waitress discovers that the man she's been serving dinner to is the same man who stole her inheritance and murdered her grandfather. For Natalia Reyes, a 24-year-old server at the Metropolitan Club, Chicago's most exclusive private establishment, that moment came on a rainy Thursday evening when tech mogul Charles Whitmore accidentally left his briefcase behind after a business dinner. For Charles, a man who'd built his empire on a foundation of theft and murder, it was the beginning of the end of a secret he'd kept buried for 4 decades. She was just trying to return a forgotten item to a wealthy member. He was just another powerful executive who treated service staff as invisible. But when Natalia opened the briefcase to find identification and discovered an old letter confessing to the murder of Eduardo Reyes, her grandfather, everything changed. The confession would expose not just a crime, but a systematic theft of an immigrant family's American dream, and prove that sometimes the most devastating truths are hidden in plain sight. This isn't a story about chance discoveries. This is about stolen legacies, manufactured accidents, and how a grandfather's love, preserved in his killer's own handwriting, would finally bring justice to those who thought they were beyond its reach. The warm glow of brass fixtures illuminated the leather-bound walls of the Metropolitan Club's private dining room as Natalia Reyes cleared the remnants of what had been a tense business dinner. At 9:30 p.m., the exclusive Chicago establishment was winding down from another evening of deals that shaped the city's economic landscape. Natalia had worked at the Metropolitan Club for 2 years, long enough to recognize the subtle dynamics of power at play among the wealthy members. Tonight's gathering had been particularly charged. Charles Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Technologies, had been hosting potential investors for his latest venture into renewable energy. At 68, Charles commanded respect through a combination of brilliant innovation and ruthless business practices. His technology empire had made him one of America's wealthiest men, but his sharp blue eyes and cold demeanor suggested a man who'd sacrificed human connection for material success. The dinner had ended abruptly when one of the investors raised concerns about Charles's company's environmental record, leading to a heated exchange that sent several guests leaving earlier than planned. In the confusion of the awkward departure, Charles had forgotten his black leather briefcase beside his chair. Natalia noticed the briefcase as she finished cleaning the table. Protocol at the Metropolitan Club was clear. Any personal items left by members should be secured in the office safe until they could be returned. But the briefcase was expensive, clearly important, and Charles might need it for early morning meetings. She picked up the briefcase, noting its weight and quality. Craftsmanship. A small brass nameplate confirmed it belonged to Charles Whitmore. Natalia debated whether to call his office or simply secure it until tomorrow. When she noticed that the briefcase wasn't properly latched, it had been damaged in some way, preventing it from closing completely. As she carried it toward the club's office, the briefcase fell open, spilling documents across the marble floor of the hallway. Natalia quickly knelt to gather the scattered papers, hoping to collect everything before any other staff members noticed her clumsiness. Most of the documents were typical business correspondence, contracts, financial reports, legal memoranda. But as Natalia gathered the papers, one item stood out, an old envelope, yellowed with age, with spidery handwriting across the front that read, "For Charles, the truth about Eduardo Reyes." The name hit Natalia like a physical blow. Eduardo Reyes had been her grandfather, an immigrant inventor who died in a factory explosion when she was just 2 years old. Her grandmother had raised her with stories of Eduardo's brilliance, how he'd developed revolutionary manufacturing processes, how he'd been on the verge of patenting innovations that would have made their family wealthy. But Eduardo had died before his patents could be approved, and the explosion had destroyed all his research. The family had been left with nothing but debts and the bitter knowledge that Eduardo's genius had died with him. Natalia's hands trembled as she looked at the envelope bearing her grandfather's name. Why would Charles Whitmore have correspondence about Eduardo Reyes? Her grandfather had been a factory worker, barely able to speak English, while Charles's family had been wealthy industrialists for generations. Unable to resist, Natalia carefully opened the envelope and withdrew a handwritten letter dated April 15, 1984, just 1 month after her grandfather's death. The letterhead showed it was from Charles Whitmore, but the handwriting was shaky, as if written under extreme stress. "To whoever finds this letter after my death," it began, "I can no longer live with what I've done. I need to confess the truth about Eduardo Reyes and the theft that built my fortune." Natalia's vision blurred as she read the opening lines. This was a confession letter, written by Charles Whitmore himself, about her grandfather's death. Eduardo Reyes was not just a factory worker, the letter continued. He was a mechanical genius whose innovations in automated manufacturing were years ahead of their time. I discovered his work when my father's company contracted with the factory where Eduardo worked. I saw the prototypes, the blueprints, the revolutionary designs that would transform American manufacturing. Natalia sank against the hallway wall, the confession letter shaking in her hands. Her grandfather hadn't been just a factory worker. He'd been an inventor whose work was valuable, enough to steal. "I offered to buy Eduardo's patents," Charles had written, "but he refused. He wanted to start his own company, to build a legacy for his family. He didn't trust me, and he was right not to. When negotiation failed, I chose theft over honor." The letter detailed how Charles had bribed factory supervisors to give him access to Eduardo's workshop, how he'd photographed blueprints and stolen prototypes, how he'd filed patents under his own name for innovations that Eduardo had spent years developing. But Eduardo discovered the theft. The confession continued. "He confronted me with evidence that would have destroyed my family's reputation and sent me to prison. I panicked. I arranged for the factory explosion that killed him, making it look like an industrial accident while destroying all evidence of his original work." Natalia felt tears streaming down her face as she read her grandfather's death sentence written in his killer's own hand. Charles Whitmore hadn't just stolen Eduardo's inventions, he'd murdered him to cover up the theft. "Eduardo Reyes died because of my greed," Charles had written. "His family was left with nothing while I built an empire on his stolen genius. His patents became the foundation of Whitmore Technologies. Every success I've achieved, every dollar I've earned, belongs rightfully to the Reyes family." The letter went on to detail specific patents and innovations that Eduardo had developed, including the automated assembly systems that had made Whitmore Technologies one of America's most successful manufacturing companies. Everything Charles had claimed as his own invention had actually been stolen from Natalia's grandfather. "I am leaving this confession because I cannot bear the weight of this secret any longer," the letter concluded. "If anything happens to me, I want the truth to be known. The Reyes family deserves justice, and Eduardo's memory deserves to be honored. His granddaughter Natalia should inherit what was always rightfully hers." Natalia stared at her own name, in Charles Whitmore's handwriting, realizing that he'd known about her all along. He'd been aware that Eduardo's granddaughter was working at the same club where he dined, serving him dinner while he sat on a fortune built from her family's stolen legacy. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For 22 years, Natalia had believed her grandfather was just a simple factory worker who died in an unfortunate accident. Now she discovered he'd been a brilliant inventor whose murder had been carefully orchestrated by one of Chicago's most respected businessmen. Footsteps in the hallway forced Natalia to quickly fold the letter and gather the other documents. She couldn't let anyone see her with Charles's confession, not until she figured out how to use it to get justice for her grandfather. Miss Reyes. The voice belonged to James Morrison, the Metropolitan Club's manager. Is everything all right? You look upset. Natalia quickly wiped her eyes and stood, the briefcase clutched against her chest. I'm fine, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Whitmore left his briefcase behind. I was just securing it for return tomorrow. Morrison's expression was concerned. You're sure you're all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Natalia repeated, though her voice was shaky. Just tired. It's been a long evening. Morrison nodded and continued down the hallway, leaving Natalia alone with the most explosive document she'd ever held. The confession letter proved that Charles Whitmore was a murderer and a thief, but it also put her in incredible danger. If Charles discovered that she'd found his confession, would he try to silence her the same way he'd silenced her grandfather? Natalia made her way to the club's business center, where she quickly photocopied the confession letter before returning the original to Charles's briefcase. She then locked the briefcase in the office safe as protocol required, but kept the copy of the letter hidden in her purse. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of shock and planning. Natalia knew she had the evidence needed to expose Charles Whitmore's crimes, but she also knew that a billionaire with Charles's resources wouldn't go down without a fight. She needed allies, legal help, and a strategy that would protect her while ensuring that justice was finally served. The next morning, Charles Whitmore arrived at the Metropolitan Club precisely at 8 a.m. to retrieve his briefcase. Natalia watched from across the lobby as Morrison returned the case, noting Charles's relief when he confirmed that the contents appeared undisturbed. But as Charles prepared to leave, he paused and looked directly at Natalia, who was setting up for the breakfast service. For a moment that felt like eternity, their eyes met across the elegant lobby, and Natalia saw something in his expression that chilled her blood: recognition, calculation, and what might have been threat. Charles approached her station with the measured steps of a predator who'd identified potential prey. Miss Reyes, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet lobby. I believe you secured my briefcase last evening. I want to thank you for your diligence. Of course, sir, Natalia replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Just following club protocol. Protocol is important, Charles agreed, his pale blue eyes never leaving her face. Discretion, loyalty, knowing when to keep private matters private, these are valuable qualities in service staff. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Charles was testing her, trying to determine whether she'd discovered his secret, and warning her about the consequences of betraying his trust. I understand completely, sir, Natalia said, meeting his gaze with feigned innocence. Members' privacy is our highest priority. Charles smiled, but the expression held no warmth. I'm sure it is. You know, Miss Reyes, you remind me of someone I knew many years ago, a man named Eduardo Reyes. Any relation? The casual mention of her grandfather's name felt like a slap. Charles was letting her know that he knew exactly who she was, that her presence at the Metropolitan Club wasn't coincidence, but potentially destiny. Eduardo Reyes was my grandfather, Natalia admitted, seeing no point in lying. A tragic loss, Charles said with false sympathy. Industrial accidents were far too common in those days. Eduardo was a good man who deserved better. Yes, he was, Natalia replied, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to surprise Charles. He was also a brilliant inventor whose work deserved recognition. Something flickered across Charles's face, surprise perhaps, or respect for her directness. I'm sure he was very talented. He was a genius, Natalia said firmly, and someday the world will know the truth about his innovations. Charles studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm sure they will, Miss Reyes. I'm sure they will. As Charles left the Metropolitan Club, Natalia felt the weight of the confrontation. He knew that she knew, and she knew that he knew she knew. The game was now in the open, and Charles Whitmore would be taking steps to protect himself. That afternoon, Natalia met with Sarah Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving corporate malfeasance and family justice. Sarah's office was modest compared to the luxury Natalia was accustomed to at the Metropolitan Club, but it felt safer, more honest. "This confession letter is extraordinary," Sarah said, reviewing the photocopied document. "If authentic, it's evidence of murder, theft of intellectual property, and fraud on a massive scale. It's authentic," Natalia assured her. "I saw Charles Whitmore's other handwriting in the briefcase. The style matches perfectly." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The challenge will be proving its authenticity in court and surviving long enough to present it. Charles Whitmore has unlimited resources and 40 years of practice covering up this crime. What are my options? We could go to the police, but that puts you at immediate risk. Charles might claim the letter is a forgery, or that you stole it, or worse, he might try to silence you permanently." Sarah pulled out a different file. "There's another approach. I've been researching the patents that Charles filed in 1984 and 1985. Several of them show innovations that seem far too advanced for the timeline Charles claims. If we can prove that the technology was developed earlier by someone else, by my grandfather," Natalia finished. "Exactly. We build a case based on the technical evidence, then introduce the confession letter as corroborating evidence. It's safer for you and more likely to succeed in court." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah's investigation revealed the scope of Charles Whitmore's theft. Eduardo Reyes had developed at least 12 major innovations in automated manufacturing, all of which had been stolen and patented by Charles. The stolen technology had generated over $2 billion in revenue for Whitmore Technologies over the past 40 years. But Charles wasn't sitting idle. Strange men began appearing near Natalia's apartment. Her phone started receiving hang-up, calls at odd hours. Her supervisor at the Metropolitan Club mentioned that someone had been asking questions about her background and family history. The intimidation campaign culminated when Natalia arrived home one evening to find her apartment had been searched. Nothing was obviously missing, but the message was clear. Charles Whitmore could reach her anywhere, anytime. The next morning, Natalia called Sarah with a new determination. "I want to go public with everything, the confession, the patents, all of it. Charles is escalating his threats, and I won't live in fear like my grandfather did." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "Once we file this lawsuit, there's no going back. Charles will use every resource at his disposal to destroy you." "He already destroyed my family once," Natalia replied. "I won't let him do it again." The lawsuit was filed on a Friday morning, with copies of the confession letter and technical evidence submitted to both the court and the media simultaneously. By noon, the story was front-page news across Chicago. "Billionaire's confession reveals 40-year murder cover-up." The public reaction was immediate and devastating for Charles. Whitmore Technologies' stock price plummeted as investors fled. Criminal prosecutors announced investigations into Eduardo's death. The victims' families from other industrial accidents at Charles's facilities began coming forward with their own suspicions, but Charles's response was swift and vicious. His legal team filed countersuits claiming defamation and theft of proprietary information. They argued that the confession letter was an obvious forgery, that Natalia had stolen it from Charles's briefcase, and that the entire case was an elaborate extortion scheme. The battle played out in court and in the media for 6 months, with Charles using his wealth and influence to attack Natalia's credibility. But the technical evidence was overwhelming. Handwriting experts confirmed the letter's authenticity. Engineering analysis proved that Eduardo's innovations predated Charles's patents, and forensic accountants traced billions in profits to the stolen technology. The turning point came when other victims of Charles's schemes began emerging. A retired factory supervisor admitted to taking bribes to give Charles access to workers' innovations. A former Whitmore Technologies engineer revealed that Charles had routinely stolen ideas from employees and contractors. Most damaging of all, the mechanic who'd sabotaged the factory equipment that killed Eduardo came forward with his own confession, implicating Charles in premeditated murder. In the end, Charles Whitmore's empire crumbled under the weight of 40 years of accumulated crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison for Eduardo's murder, with additional terms for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Whitmore Technologies was forced to pay restitution of over $3 billion to the families Charles had defrauded. But for Natalia, the most meaningful moment came when she stood before Eduardo's grave for the first time since his funeral, carrying a copy of his restored patents and the recognition that had been stolen from him. "He was a genius, wasn't he?" Sarah asked, joining Natalia at the graveside. "He was everything Charles Whitmore pretended to be," Natalia replied. "Brilliant, innovative, ethical. He would have revolutionized American manufacturing if he'd been given the chance." "He did revolutionize it," Sarah corrected. "His innovations transformed entire industries. Charles just stole the credit." Natalia placed flowers on her grandfather's grave, along with a framed copy of his restored patents. 40 years later, but the truth finally came out. "Thanks to you," Sarah said, "and thanks to Charles's own conscience, preserved in that confession letter." As they walked away from the cemetery, Natalia reflected on the journey that had brought justice to her grandfather. A forgotten briefcase, a moment of curiosity, a letter written by a guilty conscience, all had combined to expose one of corporate America's greatest crimes. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. Natalia smiled, thinking of the Eduardo Reyes Innovation Foundation she was establishing with her inheritance. "I'm going to make sure that other inventors, like my grandfather, get the recognition and protection they deserve. And I'm going to ensure that people like Charles Whitmore can never again steal dreams from families like mine." The letter that revealed a father's crime had done more than expose a murder. It had restored a family's legacy, brought justice to the innocent, and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil is the guilty conscience of the evildoer himself. Natalia's story reminds us that truth has a way of preserving itself, even in the most unlikely places, and that justice, though delayed, can still be delivered when someone has the courage to act on evidence that others would rather keep buried. Her grandfather's genius had finally received the recognition it deserved, and his killer had faced the consequences that 40 years of wealth and power had helped him avoid. The confession that made her cry had ultimately made her whole, proving that love and truth are more powerful than all the money and influence that guilty consciences can accumulate. Natalia's story proves that truth never dies. It waits, preserved in the smallest details, until someone brave enough dares to bring it to light. A forgotten briefcase, a guilty letter, and the love of a grandfather silenced 40 years. Ego became the keys to justice. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that legacies cannot be stolen forever, and subscribe for more powerful stories where hidden crimes are exposed, families are restored, and truth triumphs over power.